Welcome back to The Spoken Word. I'm Travis, and I'm your host. In this episode, we're going to take what we have learned about atonement and figure out how to trace it into the New Testament. In the New Testament, you might be surprised to learn that the term atonement is an extremely rare term. Since it was so central to Levitical thought, why did it seem to shift into the background by the time of the New Testament? Before we answer this, we need to find a way to trace the concept of kaphar from the Old Testament Hebrew into New Testament Greek. In this episode, we will learn how to decrypt New Testament Greek back into Old Testament Hebrew using the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament used at the time of Jesus and the New Testament authors. Let's dive in. This time, we're going to start bringing our conversation on atonement to a close by tracing it from the Old Testament to the New Testament. The challenge is that the New Testament is written in Greek, not Hebrew. So the question arises, how on earth are we supposed to trace an idea between two entirely different languages with any confidence at all? How are we going to trace kaphar and related concepts into a totally new language that was born in a completely different culture? Part of the answer is that the New Testament was deeply interlocked with the Old Testament. Listen to Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-4. For I passed on to you, as most important, what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. Scholar N.T. Wright noted in The Day the Revolution Began that Paul added this addendum of according to the Scriptures to firmly root his story in the story and definitions of the Old Testament. He was perhaps aware that Greeks had stories of noble deaths and stories of capricious gods venting wrath and an innocent party happening to be the lightning rod by accident. To distinguish the gospel from these pagan stories, Paul said that Jesus died in accordance with, or in harmony with, the Scriptures, not in harmony with the Iliad or the Odyssey. So it is with atonement. Jesus made atonement in harmony with the Old Testament, in agreement with it. He was the solution to the problems defined in the pages of the Old Testament. So our definitions of sin, atonement, forgiveness, and anything else important must start with the Hebrew conceptions of those things as they are described and defined in the Old Testament Hebrew. Then, ideally, if there was a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament that was written by Jews themselves, we could figure out how Jews expressed their uniquely Hebrew ideas into Greek. And it just so happens that we do have a translation exactly like that, the Septuagint. The Septuagint was the Jewish translation of the Old Testament from its original Hebrew and occasional Aramaic into the Greek language. It was written about 100 or 200 years before Jesus and was widely read in Jesus' day. It was like a Second Temple Jews NIV, if you will. The key is that it was written by Second Temple period Jews who were themselves fluent in Hebrew in the original conception of those Hebrew terms as defined in the Hebrew Bible. They would have known exactly what they meant in Jewish culture by words like kaphar or other things we've talked about. The complication is that the Greek language developed in a culture that thought very differently from Israelite culture. So, when the Septuagint translators set out to put Hebrew ideas into Greek vocabulary, it was impossible to have an exact one-for-one translation between these two radically different cultures and languages. This is true of any translation. When we are forced to convert the thoughts of one language, expressed in its own native vocabulary, into another language with a totally different vocabulary and set of meanings, we may find that there is no suitable word to precisely express the ideas of the original language. So what do? Well, you have two options. One, you can invent a new word, like Tyndale did with atonement. Remember, he coined that word. Or you can hijack existing words in the target language and rely on your own native culture and context to fill in the gaps where translations may not quite put things exactly right. The Septuagint authors seem to have chosen the hijacking method. They didn't make up new Greek words to express their very Hebrew ideas. And the reason for this is not particularly surprising. The Septuagint was expressly translated for Jews who lived in a Jewish culture. Nobody was publishing the Septuagint to try and convert Gentiles. If they read it, great, but Judaism wasn't really focused on making converts in this time period. It was reasonable to expect that the culture in which the Septuagint was written and read would smooth out any inadequacies inherent to the process of translation. In a sense, this makes the Septuagint written not in Greek, but in a specific dialect of Greek. Judaized Greek, a dialect where common Greek words were hijacked to stand in for distinctly Jewish ideas. Rather than make new words, the Septuagint authors chose to add new, distinctly Jewish definitions to Greek dictionaries. When we read the Septuagint, we should therefore view the Greek not as standard Greek, like the language used by Homer or whoever else. When we read the Septuagint, then, we should view the Greek in the text not as standard Greek, like the vocabulary and definitions used by Homer or Plato or any other Greek thinker, but rather as hijacked Greek, Judaized Greek. The Septuagint translators simply chose similar but not exact ideas from Greek vocabulary to be shorthand for the original deeply Jewish Hebrew ideas. The Septuagint was written with a Greek vocabulary, but it should and must be read with a Hebrew dictionary. They may have used the same words that Homer did, but they did not mean the same things with those words that Homer would have. One clear example of this hijacking and Judaizing of the Greek language can be seen in the Septuagint's use of the Greek word charis. This is the word you and I know from our New Testaments as grace. What is grace or charis? If you said unmerited favor, you would be right, but only if you are reading Judaized Greek. Charis, in common Greek use, usually meant something more along the lines of favor, beauty, or gratitude. The distinction is that Greek uses usually had a connotation of charis being deserved. You would merit charis for good deeds or because you were attractive or what have you. You deserved charis if it was given. In Jewish use, the Septuagint hijacked charis to stand in for the Hebrew word hin, which usually expresses divine favor and typically is unmerited favor. It could certainly mean things like beauty, but it is dominantly used for the good that God unilaterally does for his people, not because of them, but in spite of them. That is what the Septuagint authors meant when they used charis. They used a Greek vocabulary with a distinctly Hebrew dictionary. They wrote in Judaized Greek. This is important for us because the New Testament was also written in Judaized Greek. Don't just take it from me, though. I actually had a little bit of fun and asked the large language AI model, ChatGPT, to give me a Venn diagram that compares classical Greek uses of charis and Hebrew uses of hin, and therefore what the Jewish authors of the Septuagint meant by charis. The distinction between these ideas is impressive. You can take a peek at the show notes if you would like to see that diagram. There's a link to a file there with it. Here are the basics of what it says, though. It says that on the Greek side, the word means beauty, charm, aesthetic appeal. It has a social or a political use. It has this idea of reciprocal favor, and gratitude is expected from the recipient of the charis. The Hebrew idea of hin, and therefore the Hebrew use of charis, instead represents a covenantal relationship. It defines undeserved favor, unmerited favor, divine mercy, a unilateral gift, and it has an ethical disposition. Really, the main overlaps between hin and charis is that they happen to both be talking about favor or grace. They happen to be bestowed by a superior. and they can be given by both divine entities and humans. So that's all that the Septuagint authors had access to. That was the closest thing that Greek had for hin, so they chose to use charis. Now, I wouldn't go using that diagram in your doctoral thesis on New Testament Greek, but my point is that even something as theologically unsophisticated as a large language AI model can see that there are major differences between the Jewish and Greek uses of charis. There's enough overlap between hin and charis that you can see why the Septuagint authors would have used charis as a vehicle to smuggle hin into Greek. But we would end up very far off the mark if we asked a pagan Athenian to help us understand the Septuagint's use of charis. Instead, if you really wanted to understand the Septuagint and all of its subtleties, you would need to ask your local rabbi, someone fluent in Judaized Greek. This is important for us because the New Testament was also written in Judaized Greek. When Paul spoke in Greek, he would have been using Greek words like a Jew, not an Athenian. His letters are shot through with references to the Hebrew Bible, with phrases and even vocabulary mirroring the Septuagint's Judaized Greek with remarkable parity. To that point, the New Testament continues the Septuagint's use of charis. Paul wrote that it is by charis that you have been saved. And this was not of yourselves, it was the gift of God. We can now see that Paul's addendum that charis was not earned may well have been for the benefit of any Gentile Greeks used to thinking of charis as merited favor based on something good they did. Knowing this, Paul was keen to give them a Judaized definition of charis, one where charis is God's unilateral choice to show favor precisely to those who don't deserve it. Here's another example of Paul using charis in a very un-Greek way. He says in 2 Corinthians 12:9 that Jesus said to me, "My charis is sufficient for you, for my power is perfected in weakness." Jesus wasn't speaking of his own physical attractiveness, and he wasn't telling Paul that he was going to give Paul a reciprocal gift because Paul had been a good boy. Jesus meant something else when he said that his charis was sufficient for Paul. He meant an altogether different sort of charis, a Judaized charis. You can even see how the New Testament continues this tradition of hijacking and redefining Greek for a new, unique purpose. One example is the New Testament's use of agape. Many of you will have heard this term. What does that term mean? What does agape mean? If you answered self-sacrificial love, you would be right. But again, only if you are speaking Christianized, Judaized Greek. Wider native uses of agape treat it essentially as just another way of expressing affection, much like words like filio or eros and so forth. It didn't have this self-sacrificial aspect to it at all. In fact, agape didn't get a whole lot of use in the Greek language to begin with. Christian Jews hijacked this obscure term specifically to be a vehicle to express the new self-sacrificial nature of God's love as revealed in the Messiah. Agape was even rare in the Septuagint. In the Old Testament, hesed was often used to describe aspects of what we now call God's love, but they usually translated hesed as the Greek elios, which roughly means mercy. The New Testament needed a new word to add a self-sacrificial component to God's newly expanded revelation of love. So the New Testament authors grabbed the rare word agape and elevated it to be the beating heart of New Testament theology. Using agape in a novel way like this demonstrates an ongoing technique of Jews grabbing Greek words and infusing them with completely new definitions. Again, Jews like the Septuagint translators and the New Testament authors used the Greek vocabulary with a distinctly Hebrew dictionary. So, all that said, the beauty of this is that we can read and think upon the original Hebrew. Then we can go to what Greek words that Second Temple Jews were used to hijacking to stand in the place of the original Hebrew. We can turn the Septuagint into a library of Judaized Greek terms. Then we can go to the New Testament and keep our eyes open for those same Judaized Greek terms. And this opens a highway straight from the New Testament Greek all the way back to the original Old Testament Hebrew, creating a seamless flow of thought from the Old Testament to the New Testament without any paganizing influences. This is critical because the ideas in the New Testament are continuations of and solutions to the ideas of the Old Testament. The New Testament was not born in a vacuum, much less a pagan Greek culture. It did not vaguely use Old Testament passages as proof texts for something completely new and unrelated to the story of the Old Testament. No, the New Testament was born from the Old Testament. Jesus is presented as the solution to Old Testament problems, as defined by the original Jewish authors in the original Hebrew, now simply translated into Judaized Greek. So, I contend in order to faithfully understand the New Testament, we must start with the Hebrew Old Testament, reconstruct its categories and definitions of thought on its own terms, and then use the Septuagint as a Hebrew to Judaized Greek dictionary, and then use that dictionary to decrypt the New Testament's own Judaized Greek. We need Moses, not Homer, to define our terms. Failing to do so, and instead using pagan Greek dictionaries and frameworks to decrypt the New Testament, will result in a paganized New Testament, and subsequently a paganized Septuagint, and finally a paganized Hebrew Old Testament. This paganized Bible will tell a story about a different Yahweh, a different Jesus, and a different gospel. I cannot overstate how important it is for us to get these things right. With all that in mind, now that we have laid out our methodology and its importance, let's get to decrypting the New Testament. Next time, we will start with our friend kaphar, and we will trace it into the Judaized Greek of the Septuagint, and we will use that key to decrypt New Testament atonement. Thanks for listening, as always, my friends. Until we meet again, go in the peace of God.